Hello, good evening, good morning, and welcome to Rule of Carnage. This is a podcast where we propose to talk about designing better miniatures games. And you can't stop us, not well, unless you press the pause button or go somewhere else, which you shouldn't do. Now, we won't talk for too long about a subject which raised its head quite recently about well, all right, let me explain it this way. I have been designing some miniature games and putting them out on my itch, which you can find through planetsmashergames.com, blah, blah, blah. One of the games I put out recently is Flagstone, which is an exciting experiment where I took a chessboard and some miniatures and I tried to make miniature agnostic chess as a result of an earlier conversation that you and I had on this channel. And I put that out and I've had some various playtesting feedback. Thank you to anyone who has contacted me with some feedback for the game. But one of the pieces of feedback that I received this week was super interesting because I wrote Flagstone to be a crunchy little tactical sort of mini skirmish thing. It's played on a chessboard, so obviously it doesn't have a literal size, but it is quite sort of, it feels quite tight and small because you've only got 8x8 grids to maneuver on. But the feedback was that the main problem with Flagstone as a game was that it was too short and that they had 5 games in 2 hours and each of the games was too short. And this is something I'm a little bit sympathetic to because I can name some other games which I also think are too short. And they said that sort of the game had got going, but they hadn't quite enjoyed it enough before it came to its natural conclusion. So it wasn't that it was arbitrarily truncated by a turn length, but it clearly didn't outstay its welcome. And we had someone come into the Discord recently with a question: how long should a miniatures game be? And we had some juicy discussion about how to best pull apart that question. So let's have a little bit of juicy discussion about how best to pull apart that question. Glenn, how long are your miniature games?
Um, Funnily, mine tend to be on the shorter side. I think that it's because I sort of I want to hit like one experience and deliver that in the sort of
Mm,
the most the bestest momenty kind of a way, and then sort of get out before the applause stops, sort of a
hmm
thing. But I mean, it's interesting, I think there's a few interesting things there. I think one thing that's interesting is that, particularly in relation to very asymmetrical games,
mm,
I find the idea of them being too short weird because what I always want to do when I play a very asymmetrical game is switch round and let's try again. If it's that asymmetrical, was it to do with the asymmetry or was it to do with the people? Let's have a swappy do and let's
Right,
see
yeah.
what
So for
happens.
me, you're immediately summoning Netrunner to mind, where it's like Netrunner's so completely different from each end. You always swap sides, and it's fun, and you both because you basically only played half the game if you play it from one end.
Absolutely, and like borders and black flags because it's a game about boarding onto a ship. It's super asymmetrical, like in the scenarios, because the border and the defender play in very very different ways. And the way I dealt with that, rather than like completely balancing the both, is to say that a full session of boards and black flags is one of you boards, you play it through, and then you switch sides and you play it through again, which is
Mm.
also a neat solution to a game that's perceived as being quite short. Um, Equally, I think it's like I find really weird the idea of a game being too short or too long, like arbitrarily and separate from the gameplay that occurs. Generally, I can understand the idea of a game being too short, where you're like, okay, what I want is like a three-act structure.
Mm.
I want an opening and the question to be asked, and then I want the resolution of the question to be in doubt, and then I want it to be resolved, and I want the in doubt bit to have like ups and downs and reversals and turnarounds and etc. etc. And like with a game like Hobgoblin, you absolutely want, like, it's a game with two big battle lines and you want the battle lines to meet and they want to waver back and forth at least like once or twice before something breaks and gets resolved.
Yeah.
You don't want it to be a single path from and done. You want those reversals and those turnarounds.
But at the same time, you want that that end to just come a little bit earlier than you were sort of hoping for or expecting, so that there's urgency and you feel like there's not much time left. And then hopefully you get to the end and you're like, oh, all the questions did just get asked, just get answered in the last three dice rolls, and it turns out we didn't need a turn six.
Yeah,
Or the
absolutely.
turn six would have just been cleanup and it's not interesting.
Yeah, and I can understand. I can understand the perspective of being like, I wanted the game to be the sort of game that would offer reversals and turnarounds and backs and forths,
Mm.
and therefore I wanted the game to be long enough to put those things in. But equally, it's like, well, but that's this game doesn't do that. So if I'd made it long enough to put those things in, you would have just gone, oh, there weren't any reversals, and you just tromped along. It's kind of like, it's kind of like something, you watch a movie or you read a book and you're like, oh, I wish it was I wish this horror was a murder mystery. And it's like, I mean, that's fair enough. I can understand wanting to read a murder mystery, but this was never going to do that for it. It doesn't happen to have the mechanics to do that. And
Yeah,
so,
so I think we can definitely agree that like games don't have to be of a specific length. What we're looking for is a sort of curve to have existed across whatever that game needs to express that curve nicely. And then I guess, I'm thinking to like really long games. Like, why do people choose to play, those coffin-sized board games that take most of the weekend to play? Some people choose to play those a couple times a year and they want a rich experience, which basically has the same curve, but it is just spread out and you can luxuriate in it like a large, deep bath. But I think in that case, like they need to be longer because I'm not really sure. I don't play a lot of these things, but they need to have more space for the different detailed mechanics in them. And so like a very simple filler game couldn't be that long because something about the complexity of the mechanics, I'm not really sure.
I mean, I think two really great games that are very long, and I think I understand why they need to be very long.
They deserve to be that long.
Well, I don't know. I don't know that deserve is the right word, but there's diplomacy and Twilight Struggle. Okay,
Hmm.
now they're both board games, fair enough, but like diplomacy can take all day. It doesn't have like necessarily time limits on turns and things, and people go off. And for people who are unaware about what diplomacy is, it's kind of like Risk, but with no dice whatsoever, and everything is based on like bargains and agreements that you make with the other players, and none of those agreements are binding, and it is literally just about talking people into letting you win. That's basically all that the game is. Um, and it's a game that doesn't, it's very open ended in its time limit and can sort of go on, for all day or even longer if you're so inclined. And the point is, diplomacy needs you as a human being to learn about another human being in relation to this tactical, map that you're playing on. And learning people, particularly in those circumstances, takes a certain amount of time. It's just one of those things you kind of can't rush. And Twilight Struggle, which is the game of the Cold War, is another. It's a long old game, but a game. But it's a very attritional game. It's about little gains here and there and little moments and passing back and forth. And it's incredibly important that both players are around about the same level of understanding of the game because it's so intensely two people sort of pressing against each other.
Mm.
And it needs to be that length because you need to like find out what things they value and how they're going to tend to use a certain sort of card. You need to understand the bluffs they're going to make and the red herrings they're going to lay in order to get the full like piquancy of the game. And again, in order to do that, because it's about figuring out the structures of your opponent's like brain, that just takes a while. You need to repeat the exchanges multiple times and you need to savor the exchanges each time they're repeated to build up a correct picture of the person that you're playing and the way that they're playing and the structures they're going through. So those are a couple of games where I think they couldn't be any shorter because you simply can't build up the multi faceted, multifarious thing of another human being more quickly than that. But those are games that don't have a massive amount of structures between the two people and the two players. And
Mm.
what I'd say is like comparing that to something like Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and I'm just saying that because it's a game that I have a sort of a deep knowledge of, is that if I turn up to a table of Warhammer Fantasy Battle and you get your army out, I know how you are going to play. I
Mm.
know immediately what you're going to try and do, the ways in which you're going to try and do it, the things I have to do in order to counter them and reverse them and turn them around.
Right, you're not really playing the player in as a direct way as you are in
Yeah,
diplomacy.
because minis games tend to ask you to build, not just build your list, like say Magic the Gathering might, build your list and your army and then show it the whole thing complete at the start of the game.
Mm.
That's a very fast forwarding kind of a moment in relation to how much explaining you need to do. If you've got a board game, and particularly a sort of quite in depth board game, everyone's using the same tools. And so to allow people to build differences between each other, you've got to extend the time out a little bit. Whereas I don't think you need to do that with minis games, or at least you don't need to do that with asymmetrical games in which you build your asymmetrical force at home with careful consideration and then show it to another person who's meant to have studied the same book and understand what you did there when you show it to them,
Mm.
which is basically just minis games. There's pretty much nothing else that gets you to do that. Even Magic the Gathering doesn't get you to like hand your deck over at the start of the game so the person could go, "Oh yes, yes, I see.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh
yeah.
yeah, very," and then give it back again.
So another way maybe to think about like how long is the right length for a game is for me like um I'm not sure exactly how to describe this, but like how much setup is required for the juicy like everything's humming and all of the decisions are interesting part of the game. Because I think potentially what maybe what this feedback was trying to tell me, and I wish I had some I wish I had some video footage of like these guys playing. Maybe what they're saying is that it took 10 minutes to sort of get set up and do the first kind of boring moves, and then they were like 15 minutes into the game and they only maybe had like 10 minutes of really juicy play, and then we were into the sort of 5 minutes final finishing up. And so we'd have liked the juicy bits to be a greater proportion of the overall game time rather than saying the game time should be longer. I've said this a couple times on the podcast before, but like when I play Race for the Galaxy, the card game, I play to 14 cards in the tableau rather than 12 because I like to see the engine just run a couple more turns. Because I feel like, you know, when you're building a sort of synergistic tableau, there's a moment where you feel really powerful, and just holding that moment for slightly longer than I think that game does for me is what I get an enjoyment out of. Like, oh, I'm a god, the machine is humming. And so I think, whatever that moment of power fantasy realization is in the game, like there's this witchcraft of finding out exactly how long you should hold that before it becomes kind of tedious to be a god versus well, I had a taste and I want more and therefore I want to play again. And it's like somewhere in the middle is the exact amount of time that you need to give them every game.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, the old adage is, leave them wanting more. But at the same time, I think sometimes, people think of like filler game as a sort of a pejorative to a degree, where it's
Mm.
like, and I think sometimes people are like, well, what I want to spend all evening with this game. This game is nice. I like it. It's a fine friend. I want to spend hours with it. I want to.
Particularly if it's a complicated enough learning experience to get it on the table that like many miniature games are versus Love Letter or something.
Yeah, and also it can be like, look, the 10 minutes in the middle of this game are great. They're like the fillet of the steak. This is brilliant, but I then I finish and then I have to tidy up and then I have to reset and I have to go through the opening moves again to get back to the 10 minutes. And if
Yeah,
this were a 2 hour long game, I'd have 10 minutes of like the setting up and doing the boring bit at the start, and then 10 minutes of the resolution at the end. And I'd have like an hour and 40 minutes of that 10 minutes of deliciousness. That's absolutely that's what I want from you. And I think sometimes like because most games the best bit hopefully in a lot of games is kind of the middle where things are hanging in the balance and unsure, and you understand where everybody is, and but you're not quite there yet and you're still striving. And when something is like a filler game, when something is a half-hour game, a 40-minute game, unless the opening bit and the ending bit are super compacted, then that the deliciousness of the middle part sometimes gets squeezed in. I think sometimes when people like say, I wish the game were longer, sometimes what they mean is I wish the opening and the closing was shorter,
yeah,
so that like I could play it 5, 6 times in a row, and the changeover bit would be so fast and so smooth that it would be like I was playing a 2 hour long like version of that game, but it's not. I'm playing like multiple bitty bits trying to extract out the juice which has been contained within this sort of
yeah. And what's
exterior.
odd is that because the feedback here is about Flagstone, and Flagstone is, almost no, there's almost no setup. Like there's no card decks to shuffle. Like you pull all the dead models back to your end, and then you set them up on like a row of squares. You don't even have to like, and to me it feels like Blitz Bowl or something, which is the like half size Blood Bowl. Blitz Bowl is amazingly fast to set up, and then there's all this rich game immediately in front of you, and it takes like 2 seconds to set the board up. You know, versus something like playing 40k, where we have to move a lot of units into place. We have to go through, the objectives or the scenarios. We have to kind of sink a bunch of victory point condition stuff into our brain. We need to, there's a lot of loading things into my RAM before we can start to play. Um, yeah, so I think that's right, that it's like you want to leave them wanting more of the gameplay and then be immediately back into the gameplay. Like I was saying to you, I've been playing Slay the Spire, a bit late to the party there, but my dad was going on about how much a good time he's been playing. And like that's got one of those just one more go things where you die, it's 2 button clicks and you're back to playing exactly the thing that you were playing 2 button clicks ago. You're just less powerful and you've got to work your way back up to the fun. Um, but yeah, so, and what was the other thing I was going to say about oh yeah, so as you were saying there, like, one of the things that the playtester feedback from Flagstone said was that they came to sit down to play it for the evening, and it felt like a filler game versus a full meal. And I think a lot about Gasland's game length because I worry about it, because partly because it's so fluctuating, and I think that's its main problem. I think it wouldn't matter which length it was as long as it was reliably that length. Except I'm going to undermine that immediately and say I think if it was a 30-minute game, it perhaps wouldn't have been as successful and captured people's attention as a game. Whether the modeling would, that's a separate thing, but like people talk about Gaslands as a beer and pretzels game, but they never talk about it as a filler game, because you can't play a game of Gaslands in a filler slot. It doesn't take 15 minutes to play a game of Gaslands. It takes 90 minutes pretty much minimum.
Yeah, but I think that the thing is that it's 90 minutes of like hooting and hollering and laughing and
Hopefully, yeah, for many players,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. It's best when it's humming.
Yeah,
It's
it's beer and pretzels insofar as like it's a keg party rather than a go tournament.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Rather than a brain baker, it's a belly laugher.
Yeah. So
But
I
yeah, I
think I
think
think like there's a consideration going into a game design of like almost aesthetically, like what length of game feels right for this game. But there's also a positioning, which is like, very much Flagstone was written and its first test was like, could you make a miniature agnostic game that looked sort of okay to play in a public place, like in a pub or in a cafe, as I played it with Joe McCullough on almost the second playtest. Like at that point, it needs to be 30 minutes because otherwise you're kind of there for too long and it's a bit weird. But like that so it's a positioning of the game and where it fits into that player's life cycle. And I suppose potentially also I think the other thing that interacts is that because we're talking about miniatures games, there's definitely an additional kind of setup cost here, which is like, well, how much juice did I squeeze out of these miniatures and terrain that you just asked me to build specifically for it? And although skirmish games have been getting more and more quick, um, I personally have a sort of negative reaction to 20-minute long skirmish games because I kind of feel like, you know, the amount of time I would have spent painting the miniatures is just not delivered by the initial game time. Now that's kind of irrational because I can play 6 games of it. And so I think, you know, uh, um, these all add up together into like a complicated formula for like what is exactly the right length for your game. Well, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's very significant that filler games tend to be things you can fit in in a pocket of
Mm.
a big coat or a backpack. You know, I've got Love Letter in the side pocket of my car pocket, just and it's just always there because it takes
Just
up
in
no
case there's an
space.
emergency.
It's yeah, you know, it wouldn't be if I put it at a party, it wouldn't be the first one,
Yeah.
and it's like that's part of what is contained in a filler game. And minis games, even like a really low model count skirmish game, you're not just you're not putting it in the stuff into a box that size.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe you can get the minis into a shoebox, and then you've got like a play mat that's going to be like a couple of foot square is a small one, and then you're going to have some terrain. And so
Well,
you're
I
in
think,
very
that's one of the reasons that X-Wing was so interesting is
mm,
that, you could put it in literally a lunchbox and you would have everything that you needed to play and you could slide it into
absolutely.
your work bag or your school bag or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think for most minis games, it's like well, you're gonna have to go to somebody. You have to go somewhere where they got a big old table and a play mat. And as soon as you're doing that, you're not having it set upon you. You're not having somebody who's like, oh, it's a bit of a quiet social thing, and somebody pulls, a fake artist goes to New York out of their pocket and goes, well, let's try this out.
Yeah.
You're all turning up. You've done the homework. I think that I think that a game should be long enough that the good bit is at least 70% of the playtime. I think it should be long enough that you can tell them what you're going to do it, and then tell them what you did,
Mhm.
and long enough that you can have the question asked, the answer in doubt, and then the answer given. And really anything else is a bit of like marketing, a bit of positioning, a bit of like how you explain things to people.
I
I
I
mean,
think I think you can take that extremely fine advice and pop it inside out as well and say, if you wish to design a game that is 2 hours long, then make sure that it does that wiggly arc and that the middle bit is whatever 70% of 120 minutes is. And like this is honestly how they write Disney scripts as
hmm,
well. Like, they're timed to the minute. And so if your game is not reliably delivering, if it's reliably delivering too much setup, then figure out how to speed that up and get to the good bit faster.
hmm,
And because I don't know that I don't feel that shooting for any particular game length is wrong. Like all game lengths are valuable to someone, and if you're clearly communicating that that's how long your game is, but you're then following that advice so that the good bit is the most of it, then yeah.
yeah. And I think people are going to find that there are tropes and there are sort of standards for games and game lengths and box sizes, and like so that's a copy of SSO. That's a 90-minute, 2-hour game. And
No, it's wrong.
people have
It's wrong. It's the
complained.
wrong size.
Yeah, no, people have complained that isn't that's not a 2-hour game. That's not a 2-hour game. It can't be a 2-hour game. You're wrong. you know, And yeah, and and we've had people played A Billion Suns going, well, it's only 3 turns. What's the
Where
point
are
of
the other
even,
three turns? You've
where are the other,
shortchanged me.
yeah, where are the other 3 turns? And it's like, look, if you're going to do something that like strips out of what people are expecting, you're going to have to explain to them, and you're going to have to bring them along for the ride. But if you do it and then you pay it out, and they go, you were right, I was wrong. You've achieved something splendid.
Right,
Right.
and on that note of beating your players with your design goals, then let us wave goodbye to this topic. It's overstayed its 6 turns.
Absolutely. But if you haven't had enough, if you could go for longer, why not put down to the comments section, and visit the after party of talking to us about a game that went too long for you, didn't go long enough for you. The relationship of turns and box
What's
size
the best,
and
longest
length.
game that was actually still good that you've ever played?
Yeah, and what you answer the question? What is the correct length for a game? And within the seconds, ideally, I would appreciate. As you go down
And
to the
however long this video is, I will then try and design a game that takes exactly long as this video.
like with a stopwatch or just
Yeah,
emergently.
yeah.
Um, as you go into the comment section, hit the like and subscribe buttons. They're right around there, and then look at the little commenty, wordy bit sort of between the video and there, because that's where the link is to our Discord, where there are people who will spend far longer than any sensible amount of time, both with games and discussing games. And there's also a link to Mike's Patreon, where you can wing on over there and you can give him some money, and then he will design games of every variety of length for you. So you will have a taster menu of options for exactly the right period of time for your play session. But for now,
That does make me start to wonder what's the longest miniatures game I can design that's still fun. I'm going to
that's
take that
still
one away.
that's still fun.
Yeah, yeah, no, it has to still be fun. It has to
And
still
on,
be.
and on those words, I think we'll have a thank you goodbye. So thank you and goodbye. Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye bye.